Transylvanian sky was a muted canvas of grey clouds drifting lazily above the rolling hills and dense forests. For Radu, the young soldier trudging along the cobblestone path, the day felt even darker. His heart weighed heavy in his chest, his thoughts as turbulent as the distant mountains. The army had become an unbearable burden. Every day was a relentless cycle of grueling training, barking officers, and cold, sleepless nights. He had thought he could handle it, at least until he'd received the letter that shattered his heart. Maria, the girl he had loved for as long as he could remember, was engaged, and not to him. The ink on the parchment was still fresh in his mind. The news felt like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. Her promises of waiting for him, of being together once his training was over, had turned to lies. She was to marry Florin, the baker's son, a boy who had never known the hardship of the army, who had stayed behind while Radu was shipped off to train for a conflict that seemed more distant by the day. Radu had always found solace in the small Catholic church at the heart of a little village not far away from his military unit. Its bell tower stood like a silent sentinel over the village, a modest structure of stone and wood nestled at the front of the Carpathian Mountains. Every Sunday before he left for training, he had attended Mass there, kneeling in the hard pews and watching the light from the stained glass window dance on the altar. It had been his sanctuary. Now he sought it for a different reason. After Mass, Radu slipped away from the others, unnoticed, as the elderly priest gave his final blessings. He climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the bell tower, his boots echoing in the empty stairwell. His breath was ragged, his hands trembling. The gun at his side felt heavier than it ever had. He reached the top where the wooden beams creaked beneath his weight. The view of the village below was peaceful, the thatched roofs of the houses blending into the mist that hung over the hills. The smell of incense still lingered in his nose from the Mass, mixing with the scent of aged wood. But none of it brought him peace. "This is the end," he whispered to himself, fingers brushing the cold metal of his pistol. He had made his decision. He couldn't go back to the army, not after this. And Maria had betrayed him. The pistol shook in his hand as he raised it to his temple. His heart pounded and he closed his eyes, whispering a final prayer. "Please forgive me." Before he could pull the trigger, a soft voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't do that." Radu's eyes snapped open, his finger freezing on the trigger. He turned startled, and there, standing in the corner of the tower, was a young girl. She was dressed simply, her long dark hair falling in waves over her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, the color of storm clouds before rain, filled with an old mixture of sorrow and understanding. "Who?" Radu stammered, lowering the gun. How did you?" She stepped forward, her expression calm, though her voice carried a gentle urgency. "I saw you come in. I followed. I didn't want you to be alone." Radu blinked, still in shock. "Who are you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she came closer, her eyes never leaving his. "There's more for you than this," she said softly, gesturing to the pistol in his hand. "This isn't your path." Radu swallowed hard, his grip on the gun loosening. Her presence was like a balm to his tortured soul. He hadn't expected to find anyone here, let alone someone who seemed to know exactly what he was feeling. He searched her face, looking for some sign of how she could understand. "Why should I listen to you?" he asked, though his voice had lost its edge. "Because I know," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "I know what it feels like to lose everything. But it's not the end, Radu. It never is." He hadn't told her his name. The realization startled him, but before he could question it, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his. Her touch was warm, and for a moment Radu felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Go back, she urged him. Finish what you started. The pain will fade and you'll find your way again. Radu stared at her, his chest tightening with emotion. He didn't know why, but something about her words, her presence, made him believe her. Slowly he lowered the pistol, his hand shaking as he tucked it back into its holster. The girl smiled, a soft, knowing smile that seemed to hold secrets beyond her years. Good, she said simply, then turned and walked away, disappearing down the narrow stairwell. Radu stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had stood. He felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but she had saved his life. And for some reason, she had known exactly how to do it. 3 months later, Radu returned to his home village. The army training had been hard, but he had pushed through, driven by the memory of that girl in the bell tower. Her words had stayed with him, echoing in his mind during the long nights and grueling days. And now, at last, he was home. The village was just as he had left it, small, quiet, and nestled in the shadow of the mountains. The church bell chimed as he walked down the familiar streets, greeting old neighbors and friends. It was Sunday, and the church was filled with the usual people. Radu found his seat near the back, as he always did, and bowed his head in prayer. But something felt different today. As the mass went on, he found his gaze drifting toward the front of the church, where a lone girl sat. She was young, her dark hair cascading down her back, and she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. There was something about her that tugged at Radu's memory, though he couldn't quite place it. His friend Petru leaned over and whispered in his ear, "Do you see her?" Radu nodded slightly. "Who is she?" "They say she came back from the dead," Petru murmured, his voice low. "She was ill, deathly ill, just a few months ago. Everyone thought she was gone, but then she recovered, miraculously, they say." Radu's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened as he took a closer look at the girl. She was too far away for him to see her face clearly, but something about her posture, her presence, felt hauntingly familiar. The mass ended, and as the villagers began to leave, Radu stayed in his seat, watching the girl as she rose and made her way toward the door. She moved with a quiet grace, her head bowed slightly. Radu stood, his heart racing, and followed her outside. He caught up to her just as she reached the foot of the bell tower, a place very similar to the one where he had almost taken his life 3 months ago. She turned slightly, and when her eyes met his, Radu felt a shock of recognition. It was her, the girl from the tower. "You!" His voice faltered as he stepped closer. "You were there, in the tower, that day." She smiled softly. The same knowing smile she had given him before. "I told you," she said quietly. "There's more for you than what you see right now." Radu's throat tightened, emotion welling up inside him. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes soft and filled with something that seemed almost otherworldly. Then, without answering, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist that clung to the village streets. Radu stood there, breathless, watching her vanish into the fog. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of awe and confusion swirling inside him. He didn't know who she was, but he eagerly wanted to know her better, for she had once saved his life.